When you visit subtropical places where a marine heatwave has been through, and it's really like swimming over a graveyard.
But surely some of them can adapt though, can't they, Pip? They can come up with some kind of solution.
The West Australian marine heatwave of 2011, they had to close the prawn and scallop fishery for up to 5 years to allow stocks to recover.
Gosh.
Ocean Calls.
Hello and welcome to Ocean Calls, the Euronews podcast for friends of the sea. In this episode, we're talking about the long-term effects of marine heat waves. We know that seas around the world are hit by warm spells every year, and in the last decade, we've seen marine heat wave conditions hitting large areas of the oceans with temperature anomalies 5, 6 or 7 degrees or more above average in some cases. So what impact is that actually having on marine ecosystems over the years? Are habitats disappearing? Are fish stocks moving to different areas of the ocean? And what can we do to minimise the damage? So to discuss this issue, I'm joined by Pippa Moore, Professor of Marine Science at Newcastle University. Hello, Pippa.
Hiya, how you doing?
And Dr. Samantha Burgess, Deputy Director of the Copernicus Climate Change Service. Hello, Samantha.
Hi there.
Thanks for being with us on Ocean Calls. First off, maybe Pip, I can come to you. When did you first become aware of marine heat waves? When did you first hear about that concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I was actually working as a postdoctoral researcher in Western Australia when the large marine heat wave hit Western Australia in 2011. And that caused quite a lot of environmental disruption, loss of kelp forests, closures to scallop and other fisheries. And so from then on, we became increasingly aware of them. And then I became part of a marine heatwave working group in 2014, where we actually defined marine heat waves basically by stealing it from atmospheric scientists and then carried on researching it since then.
And Sam, for you?
So for me, it was during my PhD, and similarly to Pip, my PhD was in Australia, and I was studying the archives that are recorded in coral skeletons. So in coral skeletons, you can see previous bleaching events, particularly associated with El Nino. And we all know now that El Nino events lead to high sea surface temperatures, particularly around the Great Barrier Reef and the east coast of Australia, but increasingly other parts of the world as well. And, tracking these signals through the coral skeletons really shows how recently our ocean has changed drastically compared with the archive of hundreds and thousands of years that we have beforehand, particularly looking at organisms like corals.
That's super interesting. So it is a very recent phenomenon, Dan, Sam.
Yeah, very much so. So the first strong El Nino that's present in coral skeletons in the Great Barrier Reef is the 82, 83 El Nino. And then there was the 1998 El Nino, and then the 2016 and 2020 El Nino. And the earlier El Ninos aren't considered to be associated with bleaching events, but there are other environmental impacts that are recorded in the coral skeletons. But now we're seeing, I think, we've seen this year the 5th bleaching event in 8 years. So it's really increasing in frequency and also intensity.
Pip, how did you feel when you first saw this? Taking away your sort of scientist mind, how did you feel when you started seeing these marine heat waves happening?
Yeah. So I guess my PhD started in the early 2000s, where it was sort of looking at decadal scale climate change and very much looking at species range shifts and things like that, which we put down to that gradual warming. And I think what we've become very more understanding is that actually marine heat waves, these sort of stochastic events, are really driving patterns of change, and they're having real world impacts. They don't just lead to impacts on the environment, but also into people's livelihoods as well.
I was going to ask, so the temperature of the sea goes up. I'm just thinking as a swimmer, well, that's great. It's going to be more comfortable going in the water. But what do you actually see? Can the average person see the effects of a marine heat wave, for example, in Australia, where you're from?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it very much depends. Sometimes actually the where you are in the sort of species range might mean that a marine heat wave might have a positive effect on a species or a group of species. But certainly there's increasing evidence that species that are sort of near their warm water range edges, so they're more stressed by those increases in temperature, you're seeing quite widespread impacts. And that can range from changes in the very base of the food web, so the planktonic communities, which of course then become food for much higher organisms. So we know, for instance, in 2016, there was large mortalities of seals and birds along the Californian coast to the 2016 marine heat wave, which was coined the blob. And that was not because of the direct effects of changes in temperature on those birds or marine mammals, but because of changes in their food, which meant their food wasn't arriving at the same time as they were, say, for their breeding. So you saw mass mortalities.
Sam, like me, I mean, my regular job when I'm not doing this is looking at climate data coming from Copernicus and trying to understand it. And I look at these maps of the ocean and I see red anomalies and things. But have you sort of witnessed it sort of firsthand in the kind of examples that Pip's talking about, where you sort of see it and you've been there and you say, a heat wave did this?
Yes. So I guess when you visit places in the world, so shallow subtropical places where a marine heat wave has been through, and it's really like swimming over a graveyard, particularly in reef environments, but equally in rocky reef environments. The fish diversity and abundance goes down. Rock cover, or benthic cover, whether it's corals or other encrusting organisms on rocks, they die off because they've been too stressed. And I think that's what we're learning all the time, that heat stress impacts everything in the ocean, just like it impacts everything on land. So though that heat stress impacts organisms in a whole range of different ways, both positive and negative, as Pip described, but anything that humans experience with heat stress, we're likely to find that in marine organisms.
Do we have a kind of universal definition of a marine heat wave? Because in fact, we don't, as far as I understand it, have a universal definition of a heat wave at the moment, although we're probably going to end up with getting one. But do we know, Pip, is there a sort of okay, this is it, this is our definition, this is definitely a heat wave now?
I mean, I think different researchers use different things, and Samantha is a coral reef biologist or scientist. They quite often use degree heating weeks or degree heating days. But when our international working group got together, we felt actually that was perhaps making it harder to communicate the impacts of these heat waves on marine systems, and we wanted to come up with a definition of marine heat waves. The sort of definition for atmospheric heat waves is sort of 3 days above a 90th percentile of a long-term temperature signal. So we took that. Because it takes longer for water to heat up and cool down, we felt that 3 days was too short. So we defined a marine heat wave as values above the 90th percentile for 5 days or more over beyond a 30-degree fixed baseline, and based that on the sort of satellite record where we've got good understanding of sea surface temperatures. So it's an anomalously warm water event over 5 days or longer.
And your satellite record goes back to what, late 70s?
82.
82. Okay, so it's not that long, actually. But then, so since 82, do you obviously see moments of marine heat waves, and you see an acceleration of them in the last sort of 10 years or so?
Yeah, most certainly. And we've actually done work where you can use interpolated data. So that's where they sort of join up the dots, so to speak, where they've got temperature records, but then there might be gaps. And we also did work looking at, I think, 5 or 6 places around the world where actually you had a scientist go down to the end of the pier and dip their thermometer in and record temperatures for greater than a century. So combining that satellite record with that interpolated data and the scientists going to the end of the pier is that you can clearly see that actually the sort of frequency and duration of marine heat waves have intensified, particularly in the last sort of 30 years, and also work by others has shown that the intensity, so that the sort of temperature increases have also intensified over that period of time as well.
Thank you very much to all of those scientists, many of whom are long gone now, have gone and took all of those measurements, because we do look back on those a lot. And it's fascinating looking back at them. Sam, what's causing them? Is it the same as happens on land? Is this basically climate change? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, very much so. So we know that the ocean has absorbed 90% of the excess heat from anthropogenic or human-caused climate change, and warmer. The feedback mechanism, obviously, between the surface of the ocean and the atmosphere, because there's passive exchange. So warmer sea surface temperatures lead to a warmer atmosphere. They lead to more evaporation. Both of these lead to more moisture in the atmosphere, which can lead to more intense rainfall events, which can lead to a higher probability of severe storms like hurricanes or cyclones forming. In addition to all the biological impacts within the water that we've talked about, it also changes the ocean chemistry. So we know a warmer ocean has the ability to, or has less ability to absorb nutrients. So we get things like oxygen minimum zones due to warmer than average surface temperatures. And because organisms are passively absorbing oxygen from the ocean, they don't know. Just like we don't know with carbon monoxide poisoning, we don't know that the air is bad for us to breathe. So they don't move out of that area. So they end up dying. And last year we saw a number of events around the world, but there was a one that went viral of fish deaths in the Gulf of Mexico, where thousands, if not tens of thousands of fish were dead because they've been in this oxygen minimum zone and just couldn't breathe, couldn't get oxygen out of the seawater with their gills, and died. And we're seeing more of those type of events.
That sounds tragic. Are there more areas that are areas that are more affected than others?
I mean, I think that there are some hotspots around the world, and you certainly see the Mediterranean in Europe is a bit of a hotspot for marine heat waves. I think you've got recorded heat waves back to the 1990s there, then 2002, then 2003, so they're quite repeated. The southeast and, the Great Barrier Reef, the whole east coast of Australia probably, and you can see areas off the Pacific coast of the United States, and also off the sort of eastern seaboard, as well as experienced a number of repeat marine heat waves.
But the first place that was really hit where we started to become aware of it was Australia then, was it?
I think actually probably they weren't called marine heat waves, but I would hazard a guess that Samantha gave the examples of El Nino, and that's a key driver of things. So 1982, and that would have impacted large areas of the Indo-Pacific, but it's highly likely it was picked up in Australia because Australia is a wealthy nation and therefore has the money to monitor these things. And that's actually one of the problems with marine heat waves, is they occur all around the globe. We might actually not have recorded evidence of the impacts of them because firstly, the countries might not have the systems in place to actually monitor them. And secondly, actually, and this impacts the UK and Europe as well, is that actually our funding streams for going and actually looking at these things aren't reactive enough to these sort of stochastic events that occur very quickly and have impacts from the base of the food chain, from plankton right up to whales. So I think we potentially aren't seeing all the impacts that are happening as a result of marine heat waves.
You say happen quickly then. How quickly can we go from a situation of having regular temperatures to heatwave conditions?
I mean, it actually very much depends on the drivers of that marine heat wave and where they occur, but actually in shallow waters it can occur incredibly quickly. And there's evidence, it's experimental evidence rather than observational evidence, that actually the rate of onset of a marine heat wave, so how quickly you move from sort of average conditions to marine heat wave conditions, alters the response of organisms. So it's actually quite complex. It's not just the absolute temperature, it's not the length of the marine heat wave, but also the rate at which that marine heat wave ramps up and also ramps down.
But so in that situation, Sam, you've got a weather heat wave the atmosphere is warmer, and that's warming up the sea, and that happens over a couple of days. Is that it?
So just building on what Pip was saying, so the geography matters enormously. So if it's very shallow waters and you get this a big thermocline difference, so you get warmer, much warmer than average waters at the surface, then effectively the water stratifies, so it's much harder to mix with the deeper waters that are cooler, that have more nutrients within them. And when you prevent this mixing, and the same thing happens in the atmosphere, when you get these large heat domes or blocking heat waves, that you don't get this mixing, so you don't get the wind coming through, creating waves and churning up the surface of the ocean. So it's the same physical process, whether it's in the atmosphere or in the ocean. And when you prevent this mixing,
that's what I was thinking. You've kind of got it's become still. You sort of become still over the ocean. You're warming it up, and then you're not mixing it because it's still, there's no wind, and it's not mixing the water around. And that's happening more and more.
Yes, but I think to Pip's point, we weren't looking in the past, so we don't have this really good archive to understand marine heat waves, particularly where there aren't a lot of scientists or expensive analytical programs where we're going out and developing those observations. So we don't really know when the first marine heat waves occurred. We only know through archival evidence where it's recorded in animal skeletons that we have that sort of historical perspective, but it's incredibly patchy.
I think the thing is that we've always had warm periods and cool periods, and that is actually a natural phenomena. El Nino is a natural phenomena, although there's increasing consideration that actually anthropogenic climate change is driving patterns of El Nino. I think the thing that we've got here is in the increase in intensity, duration, and frequency is that we can say pretty confidently that those increases in frequency, duration, intensity are driven by anthropogenic climate change, even though marine heat waves are a natural phenomena.
Are there organisms, or do most organisms have a kind of natural defense against this? Because, as you say, it's sort of always happened. It's just that it's happening more frequently now. But are they, in theory, in an ideal world without us warming the planet, they're totally able to deal with this, I'm guessing, are they?
Yeah, I mean, species have a distributional limit that is quite often driven by temperature, but other things as well. And they will have a sort of thermal safety margin, an area of a temperature increase or decrease that they can tolerate before really negative impacts occur. They also have mechanisms, cellular mechanisms to protect their cells when there's extremes of temperature that are outside the range of the norm for a period of time. And I think that the concerns with marine heat waves is moving forwards is if they're increasing in duration, that the sort of metabolic cost of putting those protective mechanisms gets worse. And therefore, if you're having to expend more energy on protecting yourself, that's less energy you can put into reproduction or foraging for food or for growth. And exactly the same with the intensity is as those temperatures get higher, it exceeds what you're able to tolerate. And therefore, the point where you crash is occurring more regularly.
See, that's interesting. I understand kind of how then this long-term aspect starts to build up, just in the same way that it would for us, I suppose, as organisms. What's happening to them then, to marine life? I know we can't just say it's all the same, but generally, Sam, do we understand the processes that are going on? There is a heat wave in a given area. Let's take an example of it happening off the coast of the UK, where we saw heat wave conditions last year. UK and Ireland saw heat wave conditions there. What sorts of things are happening in the water to the animals, the organisms that are living there?
Yeah, so last year off the west coast of Ireland and the UK, we had a heat wave that lasted somewhere along the lines of 5 to 7 days, and it was classified as an extreme marine heat wave. And I think the definition of extreme is more than 5 degrees above average. And I think parts of that region were above 7 degrees above average for that time of year. And so this changes the physics of the system, it changes the chemistry of the system. So as I mentioned already, it makes less oxygen available. It means there's less nutrients for organisms to feed on. And this changes the dynamics of the ecosystem. So things that we haven't talked about yet, which can occur in coastal environments, are organisms that are called harmful algal blooms. So they can spread very quickly. They're known to occur when waters are warmer than average, and then they're ingested by shellfish, often by aquaculture, and then those crops or stock of aquaculture has to be destroyed because it is toxic to people. So it has huge economic implications, these marine heat waves, to society and to the industries that depend on the ocean. So it's not just that some organisms get a bit confused and maybe they bounce back and maybe their range shifts a bit, but it really has major catastrophic financial implications to industries that depend on the ocean.
But surely some of them can adapt, though, can't they, Pip? They can come up with some kind of solution.
I mean, I think as we become more and more aware of marine heat waves, I do think that actually we're getting into the position where we can start forecasting them a little bit better. So colleagues in Tasmania have developed forecasting tools for marine heat waves that they feel pretty confident about forecasting out to 6 months in advance. That
much? That's impressive. 6 months ahead.
They seem to be pretty confident about that, but that also may be because that they're pretty they've got a good level of knowledge of the drivers of marine heat waves in their system. So if they're consistent drivers and you're able to predict those, such as some of the sort of climate oscillations such as El Nino or the North Atlantic Oscillation Index in our part of the world, is that you can actually get pretty good. And as a function of that, you can then provide management advice. So, you expect a marine heat wave to arrive that's potentially going to result in harmful algal blooms or increases in viruses such as Vibrio. So you might harvest that stock more earlier so you can actually protect the salmon. I think they had a marine heat wave off Chile in the sort of late 20 teens or whatever, and that tens of millions of pounds worth of fish was lost as a function of that because of harmful algal blooms. If we're able to provide these forecasts, is that you can actually minimise that impact.
That's very interesting. Well, I think it's interesting to talk about that, sort of what we can do as humans. But let's carry on with what's happening with the organisms. We talked briefly at the beginning about there being some winners and losers. So who are the possible winners, actually, from an increase in frequency, intensity, duration, etc., of marine heat waves?
I mean, so it depends on where you are in your distributional range. So if you're at the cold edge of your range, is an increase in temperature may actually be beneficial. So we very much can see that if you're at the warm edge of your range, marine heat waves have a more negative effect than if you're at the cold part of your range. But if we want to talk sort of generalities, is that a number of species might have quite a narrow temperature tolerance, so they don't have a lot of flexibility for how warm or how cold the temperature can get. And one thing that we're perhaps concerned about, I think Samantha mentioned harmful algal blooms. I briefly just mentioned viruses, but also invasive species. So the thing that often makes invasive species very good at invading areas is that they've got broad temperature tolerances. So we know in the sort of Baltic Sea that they'd seen an increase in Pacific oyster. We didn't think that we would ever reach temperatures where they could actually reproduce around the sort of European coastline. Lo and behold, we have reached those temperatures, and we see that in marine heat waves, they start to outcompete mussels. But there's also evidence that actually when you've got these invasive species, they create more habitat complexity and lead to increased biodiversity. So, there's winners and losers. It's whether or not we want to move from what was a natural sort of system to perhaps an anthropogenically driven system through marine heat waves.
Corals, though, Sam, which you mentioned at the beginning, they're fixed. They are just going to suffer and die out. We know those are absolutely vital to fish colonies and then to fishers afterwards as well. As you say, there are economic impacts. I'm guessing is there anything much we can do when it comes to corals?
So yes, there is. And again, research plays a really important role of understanding refuges. So climate refuges, not just for coral reefs, but other types of organisms. So where the particular species in those locations seem better adapted to temperature extremes. So being able to understand why in that complex environment, that ecosystem seems to thrive at slightly warmer temperatures, and then to see what we can learn from that to build into other ecosystems, to also make sure that we've got a viability of breeding stock effectively. So most organisms in the ocean rely on passive transport of their larval phase to reseed, recolonize. So being able to protect that and make sure it's not just consumed by predators, or that a greater proportion of it is available to recruit that next generation, that all helps. And I think one of the statistics, Pip, I'm sure you know this better than me, but marine organisms are moving at about 10 times the rate of terrestrial organisms because of this passive transport. So they're moving in the northern hemisphere further north, and in the southern hemisphere further south, so away from the tropical regions where those waters are warmer. So we're getting these subtropical species further north and further south, depending on which hemisphere you're in.
That's interesting. Pip, yes, tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true, Samantha, is that while the sort of rate of temperature increase is being faster on land than in the sea, just because it takes longer for the sea to warm up, is that you are seeing that rate of change being much quicker in the sea. Part of that is, as Samantha said, because they're quite open systems with this passive transport. We also know, if you think of a weather map, and when those isotherms are close together, that means it's windier. You can have temperature isotherms in the sea, and we know that actually that the speed at which marine species have to move to keep pace with those temperature isotherms is actually much quicker in the sea than it is on land. So that also explains some of it. But yeah, we're seeing some of the fastest rates of change in marine systems compared to terrestrial systems.
How does that manifest itself, for example, around the North Sea or in the Atlantic, close to France and the British Isles? What are we seeing there?
Yeah, so one of the really cool sort of data sets we've got is something called the Continuous Plankton Recorder, which is run out of Plymouth, and it started in 1934, I think. So Alistair Hardy started it. They used the same system as they used way back then, and they used one of my favourite words, ships of opportunity, to drag these continuous plankton recorders behind them and collect plankton samples from across the North Atlantic and also now across the world. And what we can clearly see with that is that over the last 30, 40 years is plankton communities or cold water plankton communities have shifted further and further north. And that's actually got quite important fisheries impacts as well, because some of these zooplankton are particularly nutritious for fish, and some of these warmer water ones coming in are less nutritious. And that actually leads to implications for things like the cod fisheries, where they actually prefer the cold water plankton to zooplankton compared to the warm water plankton. So you see impacts on codfish.
And so the fisheries people are up to speed on this and they're moving, are they?
One of the challenges that they can't. So this is a major policy implication. So there's historical fishing rights, and fisher people from various nations are only allowed to fish in particular regions, particularly in very busy oceans like around Europe. So this brings into conflict where not only are fishers from particular nations unable to catch what they've got the gear to catch because the fish have moved out of that region, but also society is no longer eating what is found around their shores as well. So again, I can't remember the statistics of what's consumed versus what's caught locally, but there's a massive mismatch between what's caught around a European nation shores versus what people consume in that country.
And I think one of the best examples of that sort of conflict, Samantha, is actually from the sort of Canadian-US border, where they had a heat wave in 2013, I think, off the sort of northwest of the Atlantic, so around that sort of Maine sort of area. And what happened is that the lobsters moved in earlier from the deeper waters. They also molted earlier, so they actually reached landing size quicker, and it led to a glut of lobsters on the market. And what it led to is some tensions between Canadian and American fishers, with boycotts and barricades put up. And, that's, again, between two nations that sort of get on mostly, but it led to a diplomatic incident. Could easily have been somewhere else where actually the two nations don't get along so well, and could potentially lead to conflict. But the good news story about that one is when actually they had a marine heat wave a few years later, they were prepared. And so actually what they did is they put some closures in place. They also were able to predict when this marine heat wave was going to hit. So the fishermen were able to sell their fish, their lobsters earlier. So actually they made more money compared to if it had been a normal year.
Thinking about nations that get on well with each other, we're in the EU. You're in the UK, as it happens. But
sorry.
Yeah. When it comes to fisheries, we haven't historically all got on very well. That's true. But when it comes to the EU, we're obviously trying to make the world a better place every day. And then marine heat waves turn up. What can the EU, for example, do against something like that, which you just can't stop it, you can't slow it down instantly? What kinds of things can you bring in from a policy perspective to try and deal with this? Because we know it's going to carry on happening as well.
I mean, I think it is about fisheries management that is actually fleet of foot. A lot of legislation takes a long time to turn around and deal with, but actually I think we've got to think that these events are going to happen more regularly, and actually you might need to put in seasonal closures at times. You might need to alter the sort of amount of landings that you're able to have and things like that. So that does require agility that perhaps isn't always evidenced when it comes to fisheries management.
And the forecasting as well that you were talking about happening in Tasmania. Are we doing that in Europe now, Sam?
Yes, very much so. So the Copernicus Marine Monitoring Service has forecasts of marine heat waves and forecasts for each ocean basin around Europe and perhaps even globally. So there is this forecast looking at heat waves to come. But I think there's two elements here. So scientists need to be fleet of foot to ensure the information is processed and accessible for decision makers. But then the decision makers need to all agree to adaptive management and have the buy-in from every single country that is leveraging that resource. So they're all behaving the same way, because when some people do a closure and other countries don't, that's when the conflict brings in that the fishers rightly see that, well, we're following the rules, but someone else isn't. And that's the easiest way to get upset, when you see an unfair advantage when someone's following the rules and someone isn't.
What are the big points of friction there, Pip, when it comes to trying to make those sorts of adaptation efforts work?
I mean, yeah, I think I live in Newcastle on the Northumberland coastline, and we have a border with Scotland, and it's a devolved, fisheries is devolved. We've just changed a fisheries management plan here that lobsters in England, minimum landing size is going to change to 90 millimetres, whereas in Scotland, 30 minutes up the road is going to be 87 millimetres. So actually, these simple rule things can actually have wide-scale impacts, because we've got Scottish fishers that are landing their fish in England and vice versa. So these conflicts happen. So I think Samantha says everything is absolutely right. It's about getting people onto the same page and actually working together, because having different rules in different regions and different contexts leads to people feeling it's unfair. And if it's unfair, people will break the rules.
And you've talked already about closing fisheries during a heat wave. Is that proven to be effective, or is it a bit of a kind of something we do because we hope it's going to be effective? Or is it proven to be effective?
I mean, I think the West Australian marine heat wave of 2011, they had to close the prawn and scallop fishery for up to 5 years to allow stocks to recover.
Gosh.
So, the impact, this was in a region called Shark Bay. It's quite it's a long way from anywhere. It's Western Australia. It's a long way from anywhere, being in Perth, let alone in Shark Bay. And so it has huge impact on coastal communities, probably led to people leaving. But at the end of the day, they had to close it to actually allow recovery, to actually restart the fishery
And
again.
it did recover, did it?
It did. It's opened again now.
But they're still getting heat waves there, I'm guessing.
They're still getting heat waves, but that 2011 one was sort of unprecedented. It was sort of like you were saying, the sort of 6 to 8 degrees above average. So, and it persisted for a very long time.
Before we wrap things up, let's quickly talk about where we are at the moment. We can see that sea surface temperatures, at least, are at unprecedented levels at the moment. Do we expect that to continue, do we expect that to continue, and to what extent is that translating into massive sort of whole system changes that we can sort of measure and understand, Sam?
So let's break apart that question. So the global surface ocean at the moment is above 21 degrees, and it's been above 21 degrees for about the last 8 or 9 months. And that's unprecedented. So it's never been above 21 degrees as far as our measurements are able have recorded. So in the last 50 or so years, we've never seen the global ocean, the global surface ocean at this temperature. And we know as well from the dynamics of the ocean temperature cycle that March is normally the maximum temperature, and that's because it's at the end of the austral summer or southern hemisphere summer. So it's had all that extra radiation, extra sunshine from those long summer days hitting the surface of the ocean and warming it up. So last year in 2023, we saw a peak of global ocean temperatures in March. Then we saw a dip in April, and then it climbed again in May, June, July, and hit a maximum of in August. And then from August last year, it stayed much higher than average. And earlier this year, it was over 0.5 degree above where it should be for that time of year. So that's for the global ocean. There's slightly good news. So we've officially transitioned, well, not transitioned yet, but the peak of the El Nino event has happened. That was declared in December, January time. So we're coming out of that El Nino event. And when we look at sea surface temperatures in the Equatorial Pacific, particularly the eastern Equatorial Pacific, we see some blue blobs, which means colder than average temperatures. So that's good news for the dissipation of this El Nino. We're likely to transition to a neutral state, but we're looking at the seasonal forecast to understand whether we will actually transition to a La Nina state towards the end of this year, but it's too early to tell at this stage. However, when we look at other ocean basins like the Indian Ocean or like the Atlantic, they are remaining much above average. So until we see the breakdown of that signal, which hopefully we will see this April, May, it's hard to determine. But with the signal that we're seeing at the moment, so we're 0.2, 0.3 of a degree globally above where we should be. When we're at a ocean basin level like the Atlantic, we're over 0.5 degree above where we should be. And if that stays stable, then we're very likely to see marine heat waves like we did last year.
And this is just at the surface, or is this happening further down as the water tens of meters down also?
Yeah. So yes, marine heat waves penetrate the depth. I mean, we probably know less about that than we do about surface warming, because we use satellite records for that. We know, for instance, that the marine heat wave off the UK and Irish coastline last summer penetrated to about 20 meters. The only reason we know that is there just happened to be 2 ocean gliders operating on the west coast and the east coast, not to monitor this marine heat wave. They were actually doing other science. But because of that, we were able to look at that depth penetration. My understanding is the blob reached to about 200 meters back in 2016, so they can actually reach quite some depth. But we know a lot more about surface warming just because we've got satellites that are able to register it. Something that actually Europe probably does need to invest more in is sort of real-time recording of ocean temperatures and ocean temperatures at depth. So that we can really get a handle on how these marine heat waves are operating.
And what would be your one recommendation then on a European level in order to better manage the effects of marine heat waves, Pip?
I think I would probably recommend that Europe looks towards Australia, that has an integrated marine observation system, IMOS, which sort of covers the whole of Australia. I also think we perhaps need to look to the American system, where they have these long-term ecological sort of monitoring programs that enable us to actually look at the impacts of these marine heat waves to get a baseline of what things are and then how they respond afterwards. At the moment, we just don't really have that because long-term monitoring isn't considered sexy.
Samantha?
Not sure you're allowed to say that on a podcast.
That's all right.
Yeah, so we've still got a massive data gap in our oceans. So at the moment, we only have data down to 2,000 meters, and the Marianas Trench, which is the deepest point on our planet, goes down to 8 kilometers. But the main seafloor, so the abyssal plain around our planet is down at about 4 kilometers. So we're missing 2 kilometers of ocean where we have no data at all. And this is because the autonomous vehicles that Pip mentioned, they only have the ability to go down to 2,000 meters. So we have observations in the top 2,000, and we know from those observations that the whole top 2,000 meters of the ocean is warming up more slowly than the surface, but so when we look at the ocean heat content change, we're looking at 0 300 300 to 700, and then 700 to 2,000 meters, and they're all warming up. But the reality is we don't have those observations at depth, so we're modeling it. But of course, we really need those models to be verified by data. So more observations, and I think more adaptive management from decision makers to make sure they can feed in the scientific evidence to then make legislation fit for purpose for the communities and industries that depend on the ocean.
And finally, there is a human cost to this as well, then. I mean, you've already talked about some of the impacts, but how would you, let's say, what are your concerns about the human cost of marine heat waves moving forward, Pip?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge area that we've got to be concerned about. These are people's livelihoods. If you're in developing nations, that could actually lead to hunger and potentially mortality. If we're talking in a European context, if you're a salmon farmer, or if you've got seaweed aquaculture, or you're a fisher, the impact on your physical and mental well-being of the financial impacts, it could be quite large. It's also worth thinking that actually there might also be benefits. There is now a blue shark tourism fishery off the coast of Cornwall and off the coast of South Wales that is driven by temperature increases, so that they can guarantee that there'll be blue sharks that people can go and swim with. So there's lots of concerns about the negative impacts. But there is potentially always a silver lining to these things as well.
You might get to see a blue shark on holiday in Wales.
Yeah.
Sam, the human price, I suppose, of these marine heat waves, because it can seem a bit abstract. You look at the map, you might hear about it, you just think, well, the sea's a bit warmer. But actually, this is lives, this is livelihoods, this is businesses, and it's other things too.
Yeah, Pip explained it very eloquently. And I think, we focused on extractive industries like fisheries and aquaculture, but this also impacts coastline security as well. So in addition to the heat wave impacts on organisms like fish and shellfish, it impacts coral reefs, which reduce the impact of strong waves to shorelines, and same with mangroves. So all of the marine infrastructure that protects coastlines also have a temperature threshold. So these marine heat waves impact the structural stability of those. So we're not only looking at losing livelihoods in terms of fish stock losses or aquaculture losses, but people can lose their homes, whole communities can lose their towns due to the storm surges that aren't being protected by that ocean infrastructure.
And I think Samantha pulls out mangroves and coral reefs, which are in the tropics. But, in Europe, we're in a temperate environment, and kelp forests do exactly the same thing in terms of coastal protection. So it's not just an abstract issue for countries a long way from where we're sitting. This is an issue that's likely to impact us all.
Pippa Moore and Samantha Burgess, thanks very much for joining us on Ocean Calls. That was a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No worries.
Thanks very much for watching this episode of Ocean Calls on YouTube. One more thing, please head over to your usual podcast app in order to listen to this episode with extra interviews and content on this topic. Catch some surprising facts and hear extraordinary tales of the sea from musicians, actors, activists and even astronauts. This season, for example, you'll hear from sex education actor Chris Jenks and fresh fish-obsessed Dutch chef Bart van Olfen. I'll see you soon.
Ocean Calls.